conference will now be recorded.
Greetings, everyone out there in cyber world. Welcome to another thrill-packed session of Brothers in Arms. I didn't tell you this, Steve, that I saw yesterday a little clip on Fox News. They were interviewing a couple of the men's U.S. hockey gold medal team, and the big caption they had on the screen underneath on the interview was "Brothers in Arms." That's the title they
Really?
gave it. So
They stole it from us. They stole it.
yeah, we came up with that originally. No one else had ever thought about that until we came up with it. So I thought that was kind of neat. Anyway, this is session number 8 of Brothers in Arms, and our theme verse is uh, Proverbs. Was it 17:17, 16:16? What is it?
17,
17:17.
17.
I never get this part right, no matter what. Anyway, a brother, a friend, loves at all times, and a brother is born for adversity. I probably should have that like typed out in front of me at all times because I stumble over that for some reason every time. But at least you all know we're being authentic. We're not being too rehearsed, obviously. This is session number 8 of this, and we're basically trying to add some extra comments on the daily and weekly Bible readings that Liberty Church is going through. And this last week we closed out Leviticus, so the last third or so of Leviticus, starting in chapter 18, 19, along in there. This morning we covered through Numbers chapter 6, and a good part of that we may save for next session because that'll be included in our entire session on Numbers. We may get into a little bit of some of that today, just depending on how far we go. But the Lord is preparing them to be a holy nation. And that word holy is one of those Bible words that often takes on a meaning to most people that is a little bit different than how it's intended to be used. It doesn't mean perfect or sinless. The real idea of it is set apart, sanctified, or different. And the Lord is trying to set them apart from where they came from, Egypt, and where they are going to, the Canaanites. So the purpose of all these various laws is, number one, to give them a government nation structure to operate by because they were a state religion, meaning that their religion, their religious laws, and their civil laws were mixed together. And God was their king, and the tabernacle and then the temple was their central meeting place, worship place, sacrificial place for the priest to operate in. And the priest and the kings and the prophets were the triple fold structure of that nation operation, very much like the threefold branches of government that the United States operates under. They provide a checks and balances to each other. So we think of the king as being the one in total control, the boss, the sovereign, and yet we have many examples in the Old Testament of the prophets rebuking the kings to their face. And then they all had their different responsibilities. They were to kind of check and balance each other to a degree, and they provided a stable structure for the nation to operate by. And so the book of Leviticus is providing the operation of that central place, that tabernacle. So it spends a lot of time regarding the sacrifices within the tabernacle, the duties of the priesthood within the tabernacle, and the responsibilities of the people of the nation in bringing their sacrifices to the tabernacle and then the temple. And so it was intended to also provide for them even though there were 12 tribes and the Levites scattered throughout, they had different land inheritances, so they lived in different areas. But that tabernacle and then the temple provided that unifying force. And then the holy feast days throughout the year, bringing them to Jerusalem later, wherever the tabernacle was, and then the temple, was intended to show that they were a single nation under God, even though they had their separate tribes. And so the idea of diversity within each of their tribes and yet unity as a whole nation. So these laws that God gave to Moses and that he transferred to the nation is a perfect, beautiful system of operation of a holy nation. And we in New Testament days, church days, we call it, church age it's often called, often have a negative view of the law or the laws that were given, but they were intended for a positive purpose to provide structure as a literal nation and to provide daily reminders that they were set apart or separate, different than the nations around them. And even though Israel came to misuse the laws or abuse them or to make them into some things they were not intended to be, as given, the laws had a positive role in their operation as a nation. In 1827 of Leviticus, I may have referred to this last week, I'm not sure, but this idea, he says in 1827, do not defile yourselves with any of these things. You just give them the laws of sexual morality and separation of practices from the nations. And he goes on to say, for by all these the nations are defiled, which I am casting out before you. And so that's why by the time they went into the land under Joshua, God had already made it clear that I want you to wipe them out. Because he had told Abraham 400 years earlier, Genesis 15 and 16, that they're going to be strangers and even slave servants in another place, which ended up being Egypt. And he says, until the iniquity of the Amorites is complete. So he removed them from the land of the Canaanites, the Amorites, all of those ites, for about 400 years, allowing those people of the land of Canaan to become so wicked that all of them basically became like Sodom and Gomorrah. So God was justified in wiping out Sodom and Gomorrah. And when all of the people of the land became like Sodom and Gomorrah, he was justified in wiping them out. They were, we might say, beyond redemption in that sense. And so God removed, because a few of Jacob's sons had already married Canaanite women. Even the tribe of Judah started out with a Canaanite woman. And so by removing them and taking them to Egypt and putting them in Goshen, which was kind of a set apart area of Egypt. So even then, in being shepherds instead of cattle people, they were somewhat separate even in the land of Egypt from Egypt, although it influenced them to a great degree. So God planned to wipe out the Canaanites under Joshua. And then when he brought them out of Egypt, he wiped out Egypt, basically, all the firstborn and the armies in the Red Sea. So he took care of both sides. I want you to be different from Egypt. I want you to be different from the Canaanites. And to show you that in a graphic way, I'm going to wipe them out. And then when you settle the land, I want you to abide by these laws, which is the laws were a sanctifying process, making them a holy people and designed to live in peace with God and with others, with their neighbors. So we have the two great commandments, one in Exodus, in the giving of the Ten Commandments, uh, and in Deuteronomy 6 and 7, and those kind of places where the Ten Commandments are given. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. And then in Leviticus 19 and 18 is where we find the second great commandment, love your neighbor as yourself. So we might add a third big reason for all these laws. So many of them fit under the category of living in peace with your neighbors, whether they be fellow Jewish blood people, or as it calls them, strangers or foreigners who come in among you. That if you live by these laws of honesty, of fair dealings, of not trying to take advantage, not being a thief, um, just so many of the laws are designed to fulfill that second great commandment, to live in peace with your neighbors. And of course, the others are designed to live in peace with God. The other thing I would say, and then Steve has some things about some recurring phrases that I think would be interesting, is so many people kind of shrug or shudder or uh, resist uh, when they come to reading through a book like Leviticus. It's very repetitive in some cases. It deals with things that we don't practice today. And so people think, well, what is there in there for me? Well, first of all, everything in Leviticus about the sacrifices, about the priesthood, about the holiness being set apart, blessings, curses, you name it, they all find a highway, a straight line to Christ. There's application to Christ all through the book of Leviticus. So when you look at it that way, it takes on a more meaningful uh, and connecting it to Christ gives it a deeper spiritual application. But beyond that, the principles within the book of Leviticus, I was thinking about this morning. The Apostle Paul was immersed in the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament, we call it. And whenever he was writing his letters, always in the back of his mind, he had his vast knowledge of the Old Testament Scriptures, and he incorporated most of those principles into his letters. For instance, compare the book of Leviticus with the book of Romans. And the same principles are found in both. What is found in Leviticus and Romans? You have the principle of forgiveness through the shed blood. You have the principle of holy living. You have the principle of spiritual growth. You have the principle of being set apart. As you go through Romans, you're covering, maybe in a little different language, the same principles that are found in Leviticus. And I think this is on purpose. Again, Paul always trying to tie the different parts of the Bible together. And he's dealing with the same themes in a book like Romans as Moses was dealing with in a book like Leviticus. So I hope this kind of understanding helps you appreciate a book like Leviticus more than just seeing it as a bunch of laws and practices that really don't apply to me today. There's a lot of spiritual growth, importance, food that can be brought over into the New Testament scriptures by looking at it this way. Okay, Steve has some recurring themes that come across in Leviticus that I think, again, ties in with themes in the New Testament. And so I'd like to have some discussion on that. So take it away, brother.
You provoked some additional thoughts with your opening statements. I was before I get to some of the things I want to mention in Leviticus, you had tied together some of the in Sunday's sermon. You in your opening statement, you tied together or tried to connect with the listeners about the importance of the principles laid out in the book of Leviticus and on Sunday. And I would encourage any of you who have access to our Pastor Rick's sermon on Sunday to listen to the message that dealt with leprosy. That's covered extensively through the book of Leviticus. It seems kind of boring. We don't have to deal with that much today, but they had to deal with it then. And if it was true leprosy, if it was something else besides leprosy, it manifested itself by going away or getting better. But true leprosy couldn't go away on its own, and we have a few examples in the Old Testament and New where that required the Lord handling those. So very good examples about where we stand before God. We're not clean on our own. We're outside the camp, and it's going to require that go-between between us and God. So a lot of good stuff in Leviticus. But one of the things that I thought about as you were going through there, and the firstborn of Egypt were all killed. There's no way to know this, but in next week's session, we're going to talk a little bit about the numbering of the Levites that are now going to serve the Lord in a way that the firstborn position, around 22,500 or so. I forget the exact number. I kind of wonder if that's how many of the firstborn in Egypt that were killed. If there's some relation there, because there's some strong statements about my firstborn, and you let my firstborn go, and I will judge your firstborn. So maybe some connections there that I hadn't thought about before, and again, no way to prove it, but it seems like it could there's enough circumstantial evidence there that might lead you towards that thought. I wanted to mention some recurring phrases in the book of Leviticus in particular, certain repeat phrases. I opened up the
Could I stop you for just a minute?
Yeah.
Could I stop you for just a minute? Could you, I don't know if this is the cause of it, but could you bring your microphone side of your earphones to outside your collar? I'm not sure if that's causing it, but there's a little bit of static sound coming through your voice, and it may be your microphone was rubbing up against your throat or inside collar or something.
That was probably it. Is it better?
Yeah, it's better now.
Okay.
I don't want there to be any hindrance.
Well, if there's any misunderstanding, we'll just put it off on that. One of the key phrases that I read over and over, especially in chapter 19, is "I am the Lord your God." "I am the Lord your God" is mentioned 21 times in Leviticus, and "I am the Lord" 28 times. 7 times just alone in chapter 19, so 49 total that I could count used in the book of Leviticus. And it's always at the end of a statement or a particular point that the Lord is providing. I thought of it as I considered that, seeing that over and over and over. To me, it's kind of similar, or felt like a little bit like a signature at the end of a legal document. Here's some legal absolutes that God is laying out, and he's signing the bottom of each one of those statements. Sign here on the line. we needed to know, they needed to know that there's no other authority but God. He's the final authority. We cannot alter what that contract or that document says. He has signed it. So I kind of felt like that when I saw that statement over and over and over. I said it, I signed it, it cannot be altered at all. And, Nadab and Abihu tried to alter it just a little bit, and that didn't turn out very, very well. So nothing could be added and nothing could be taken away or left out. And the left out part we'll uncover some as we move forward in the history of Israel, that became a problem sometimes, just the leaving out of the expectations laid out by the Lord. So I wanted to point that out. You have any thoughts on that statement, I am the Lord,
Yeah,
your God? Or
one thought that comes out, and I think there's a really good connection there. So how many times did he say some form of I am the Lord?
and 49 times.
49 times. I counted one time, and it seems like in my memory, it was about that same number, but I have to double check it. So this is in their beginning, when they're leaving Egypt, and he's establishing them as a nation. And he says part of the purpose of all this is because I am the Lord. But in the book of Ezekiel, that talks so much about the return of Christ and the establishment of the remnant of Israel that make it through the tribulation into the kingdom, and his dealings with the Gentiles, if my memory serves, it's somewhere around 50 times where the statement is said, then you shall know that I am the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
So it's almost like when Christ returns, defeats his enemies, rescues Israel, marries his bride, sets up his kingdom, that it's going to be like a 1,000-year statement of, you know what I said back there in Leviticus? That I'm telling you this because I'm the Lord and it's for your good. Well, now you know what I meant, because now you know this shows I am the Lord. Yeah, kind of the conclusion of the story in some way. I need to develop that a little bit further. The connection of saying that in the beginning and then showing it in the end after Christ returns. So that's maybe someone who listens to this will jump on that and share it with us. But that's my eternal optimist coming out, so I may have to do it on my own.
Oh, that was a very good thought and a very good connection. It appears that he is making this statement, but it would appear we see evidence through the history of Israel that they also needed to learn that. So there will be a time to where now they will know it, but it will be through much difficulty that they come to know it. So that was a phrase that I thought was repeated over and over. Another phrase that I've struggled with a little bit in my learning history is the term cut off. How many times the word cut off? I will cut you off if you do this or if you don't do that. I looked up the Hebrew word karath, and that's probably not the way you say it, but I'm not going to speak through my gut when I try to say it. It for 4 times it's translated cut off or cut down, and then 13 times it's cut asunder, I think is what I looked up. So that would be cut up. And so when we go through the book of Leviticus, and it's used fairly regularly as a warning, in 20, I'll just read some verses here that use it. And this is where I've had a challenge in my learning. If I'm if I've sit under a teacher that emphasizes very heavily what a separation from being part of God's people or being separate from God's will is, if that's a heavy emphasis, the cutoff was taught to me as being very eternal, and it might be. But in context here, I wanted to read, starting with chapter 20, verse 1, Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Again you shall say to the children of Israel, whoever of the children of Israel, or the strangers who dwell in Israel, who gives any of his descendants to Moloch. And I hope to develop that thought a little bit more as we move forward and they get closer to the entering into the land. I want to talk about Moloch and some of the connecting to your opening statement about the justification of eliminating the people of that land. We'll develop that a little bit more as we move forward. But he shall surely be put to death. So the cutoff in those verses are, he shall surely be put to death. The people of the land shall stone him with stones. I will set my face against that man. Well, that's something I wouldn't want the Lord to do towards me. I will set my face against that man, and I will cut him off from his people. So that was when I was reading some of these verses, cut off from his people. It doesn't necessarily say cut off from God or from the Lord or from the nation. It's his people. Because he has given some of his descendants to Moloch to defile my sanctuary and profane my holy name, and if the people of that land should in any way hide their eyes from the man. So, in other words, if you see it and know it, when he gives some of his descendants to Moloch, and they do not kill him, again tying to you kill him if he's done this, then I will set my face against that man also, and against his family, and I will cut him off. So if you witness it and you know it, you are still held responsible. But the end result is the cutoff seems to be tied to physical death in this context. So it seems to equal death. Again, in verse 5 and 6 of that chapter 20, I will set my face against that person and cut him off from his people. So it seems to be connected to death in that context. Have you thought about that, or do you have
No, that's interesting. No, that's to think about that a little bit more. I think you're onto something there.
And literally to be physically cut off from that people would have it would have some future and maybe eternal ramifications too, that you were put to death for that extreme evil. But in chapter 22, there's a little bit different take on the cutoff. When the Lord is speaking to the priest, he's speaking to Aaron and his sons. And the Lord said to Moses, saying, Speak to Aaron and his sons, that they may separate themselves from the holy things of the children of Israel, and that they do not profane my holy name by what they dedicate to me. That's verse 2. I am the Lord. There's one of your I ams. And oh, by the way, the I ams that I mentioned earlier, I wonder, I didn't look it up, but I kind of wonder if we can consider how many times the I am the Lord, but the I am part of that has a deeper meaning that we want to consider. Verse 3 says, Say to them, whoever of all your descendants throughout your generations who goes near the holy things which the children of Israel dedicate to the Lord, while he has uncleanness upon him. So uncleanness upon him, he's talking to the priest. I'm thinking that if a priest is unclean, that person shall be cut off. Now here's the extension, from my presence. So in that case, to the priest, it seems like the cutting off from my presence means you become disqualified to be a priest. And it feels like that might be forever. It's that serious of a infraction or a sin. Have you thought about that one at all, about being cut off
Well,
from
I
being
was kind
a
of thinking
priest?
about something a little different because you've opened up a thought to me. I think there's something there. It's interesting that all of these references about uh, priests and also regular citizens doing things that can cause them to be cut off either through death or through uh, exclusion from the priesthood is so close in connection to those chapters about lepers. Lepers were a people cut off from so many things within Israel, almost as if they were dead in some ways. And it's almost like God is saying, don't think it's only lepers who can be cut off. Any of you can be cut off uh, to the level of almost being a leper spiritually by committing these kind of sins. So it's kind of a warning. It's kind of like maybe they'd see lepers outside the camp, and they'd see them wearing their mask, and they'd see them their fingers and toes kind of their ears and noses kind of all messed up, and thinking to themselves, um, "I'm so glad I'm not a leper, uh, cut off from the people, cut off from the things of God in many ways." It's almost like God is saying, um, don't don't think that you can escape the same kind of experience as a leper by thinking you can do anything you want. At least you're not as bad off as a leper. You can be cut off too in different ways. There's something there to develop that I think is real interesting, that is so close in connection to the chapters on the lepers being cut off.
Maybe Nadab and Abihu were definitely, you could say, they were cut off for sure. So just some phrases that came up over and over about being cut off, and again in my lifetime sitting under certain teachers, maybe having different views of what that might mean. And there is a teaching throughout the entire Word of God. You can be like Esau and even beg to get it back, but you don't have the firstborn blessing once you've sold it. But the thought of the priest, it was unclear, but there are the mercies of God and the opportunity that the Lord has given in the book of Leviticus is if there's certain impurities upon peoples, he made a way for them to offer in a certain manner that would then help cause them to eventually become declared clean and not unholy anymore. So, I don't want to eliminate any of the mercies of the Lord when we talk about cut off and just assume what that means in the extremity just right off the bat. We kind of want to assume that the mercies of God are being mentioned over and over, even throughout the law, that God has made a way and that he is in the center of their life, in the middle of their neighborhood, and they often are to present themselves in a way to where if they sin intentionally or unintentionally, there is a way. But we don't want to carry that to where there's no sin unto death either, because there is. And we have plenty of examples of that. So anyway, that was my thoughts on those two statements over and over.
Good. That's good. So we've kind of brought up a little bit this idea of God is developing a set apart holy nation united by that central tabernacle, priesthood, sacrifices, same laws, same expectations. So this idea of oneness, even though there are differences in offices responsibilities within the nation. And this idea of God showing them there can even be an equality of punishment or of being banned, in a sense, being cut off is the term you used. The same as lepers with other people can be cut off in some of the same measure as lepers. And I brought up in the sermon Sunday that this is also shown in the ceremony of dedicating or consecrating, setting the priesthood apart for their office in chapter 8, verse 23 and 24. But that ceremony of applying blood to their right ear, their right thumb, their right big toe is the same ceremony used in the cleansing ceremony of a leper or some similar kind of skin disease that has been healed. And why the same ceremony for the leper as for the priest? Again, I think to stress this central idea that God wants to impose on them or impress on them. Yes, there are different offices, there are different leadership roles, there are different levels of responsibility in many ways. But in my eyes, as far as grace and love and care, importance, you might say, the priest is no better than the leper, and the leper is at the same level as the priest in the sense of God's love and care for them, so that the priests do not get elevated in their own mind that we are such a set apart class with this ceremony that no one else can experience that makes us better. God says, oh yeah, uh, I'm going to make sure that you can't think that, at least in the ceremony part of it, is because I'm going to have the cleansed leper, the one that you at least thought had leprosy or some severe skin disease, the same cleansing ceremony as what the priests have, to show that all are part of this holy set apart nation, and that in many ways you're equal to each other in my eyes, even though you have different responsibilities. And again, that's another important theme that's brought over into the New Testament, 1 Corinthians 12 and Romans 12 and other places. Many members, but one body. So that even though God has different callings, giftings, offices, he makes sure in especially Paul's writings that in God's eyes, that doesn't necessarily mean you're better. In fact, in many ways, those that do not seem to have the most important roles are more important in God's eyes. But this idea of what I've loved this idea through the years, the idea of diversity, but unity. So unity does not mean uniformity. He does not want everyone to be the same. But there can be diversity of roles, but unity of purpose, unity of devotion to God, unity of fellowship and care and love for each other. And that's what, again, 1 Corinthians 12 starts out by talking about. There are diversities, differences of gifts, differences of callings, differences of roles, but the same Spirit all the way through. And it was incorporated into Israel. It's incorporated into the church. And I think it will be incorporated into the millennial. There will be different roles, responsibilities, offices, but you can all still be part of a bridal people, and doesn't mean one is better than the other. And diversity in the midst of, or unity in the midst of diversity is a real important principle in the Bible.
You brought up on Sunday, again, leprosy, and you brought up the examples that Christ during his personal ministry, how he healed the leper singular, and then he healed the 10. So we have those examples of him healing somebody of leprosy, which during that time, and especially during the time of Exodus for sure, there was no cure for, because it's the antibiotic cure that is needed. So you brought those points out really well. But I was thinking after your message on Sunday that I kind of wonder if all of those things that even disqualified a person from being a priest, you have a limp, you have a limb longer than the other, you have some type of physical imperfection, we can say. I kind of wonder if, I kind of thought about making a list of all those things that are mentioned in Leviticus and trying to find out in the Gospels if Christ actually addressed every one of those. I kind of feel on the surface like that would kind of make sense, that now Christ is saying you can be, no matter what. There was a time you couldn't serve in a certain capacity, but I'm going to make it so you can. That's not going to be an exclusion or disqualification anymore if you make the right choice and trust in me. Yeah, so that's just a thought after your sermon on Sunday that may be interesting to pursue.
I think that is probably very accurate. I think the miracles that Jesus performed were not random. And in his mind, he knew he was addressing particular laws of that would disqualify you from priesthood in the Old Testament. He made sure that his different miracles took care of every aspect of the fall into sin. So there were miracles of nature, we would call it, calming the storms, and there were miracles of provision. Because of sin, there's been droughts and starvations and things. So he did miracles of providing food. Certainly there were miracles of healings of diseases because of sin. So his miracles on one level was simply because he cared for people. He loved them. He wanted to help them. We don't need to eliminate that part at all. But also I think his miracles probably fit into, they were very orderly, organized in his mind. And in many cases, I think he had things from the Old Testament, whether it be the entrance of sin or whether it be the various laws that prohibit you from certain roles in Israel. I think we're going to find out in the millennial that every miracle had a larger purpose behind it to him than what we see when we just read about that miracle.
Mm-hmm. That may have been why there were sometimes he just said that's enough, and he wanted to remove himself from the crowds because the list is complete. but he always healed those that finally made it to him and would trust or have just a little bit of faith, even, and he would heal them. But so many of those things, like the issue of blood and some of those things, kept you from even serving the Lord, not even in a priest capacity, but in any capacity. Couldn't come to the temple, couldn't participate at all in any of the feast, couldn't even be around people in some cases. So all of those he took care of, and I believe when we read things like it's all finished, it is finished, it's not just about what happened on the day of crucifixion. His entire reason that God sent him was completed. Everything on that list has been checked off, maybe multiple times.
Yeah. We only think we know all that he meant when he said it is finished. He probably had so many more things in mind than what we normally apply. So maybe to kind of complete Leviticus, there's a few more important things to deal with in Leviticus. You get into the Day of Atonement chapter 16. It's really important, the Day of Atonement. The scapegoat, the goat that was killed, and the scapegoat kind of ties back to the cleansing laws of the leper, the bird that was killed, and then the other bird that was dipped in that blood and then set free. Kind of speaks about the same thing of the necessity of blood of an innocent, and then the result of that is being set free, shown on the Day of Atonement. And there's a lot to say about that. And then there's the chapter 23, the feast. That's a really important chapter, the 7 annual feasts. But really there's 8, because I like to talk about 7 plus 1 equals 8, is a recurring theme throughout the Bible. Anytime there's 7 listed of anything in the Bible, read the larger context, and you might find an 8th that's kind of connected but separate in some way. And then the idea of the 7 days of creation, and the 8th being the start of a new week, the 7 ages or 1,000 years or whatever you want to say, 7 days of history, the 7th being the millennial, and then the 8th being the eternal age, the beginning of new. And that's built into a lot of things. And the feast days has this in several different ways. One, that there's 7 annual feasts, but that chapter 23 starts out in verse 3 with the weekly Sabbath. So that's the 8th. But it's not quite like the other 7, because it's every week instead of once a year. So it's connected to the 7, but a little different than the 7. So when you read through the scriptures, keep this in mind. You'll find this idea of 7 plus 1 equals 8 more often than you realize. And then these 7, even within the 7, the spring feasts have a 7 plus 1 equals 8, because you have the Passover day starting, and then you have first fruits, but then you have these 7 days of unleavened bread. So the Passover is kind of set apart from the unleavened bread, but it's closely connected to it. And same thing in the fall. You have it ends with the tabernacles, which is 7 days, but then there's the 8th day that you come out of your booth, your Sukkot, and you celebrate. So it's connected to the 7, but it's a little different than the 7, and it closes out the year. And it's kind of interesting that the yearly feasts begin with something very solemn, Passover, and then something very celebratory, a celebration, a feast, joyful happiness on that 8th day of Tabernacles to close things out. Really a great picture that our journey with God, our relationship with God, begins with something very solemn, the death of Christ, but it is designed to end in the future with celebration, to close it all out in the millennial and so forth. So just a lot of those kinds of things are built into the 7. And you're going to talk about something like the busyness of the 7th month. What do you have to say on that?
Well, you have the 10th day, and then you have the 15th day, I think it is.
15th is Tabernacles.
15th Tabernacles. It seems to be a really busy month, but I did want to talk about the Day of Atonement a little bit, and another word that I came across that repeated itself quite a bit. And it seems like it's, I could be wrong. I wanted to look this up and kind of forgot, but it seems like you shall afflict yourselves or humble yourselves when it comes to the days of feast days or the festival days. that they were expected to keep. It only seems like when I just read over real quick that word afflicted is only tied to the Day of Atonement. That's a day to humble yourself, knowing that today the high priest is going into the Holy of Holies to make atonement, kind of thought. And in the 23rd chapter, the 29th verse, there's a warning for any person who is not afflicted in soul. On that same day shall be cut off from his people. So there's another cut off. But if it was, the Day of Atonement was to be a day, it seems like, that you were to be very humble, very mindful of what was going on that day, and definitely was not tied to a day of celebration, but a day that you were to afflict your soul. So the term afflict your soul is used a couple times in the end of that 23rd chapter in connection to the Day of Atonement. I mean, I could be wrong about the word afflict being tied to some of the other feast days, but it didn't seem like it when I did a real quick scan this morning.
No, I think you're right. It was even more than Passover. It was because Passover had an element of joy because it was a picture to them of their deliverance from Egypt. And so it was to us, the idea of Passover, connected to the death of Christ, makes it pretty solemn. But to them, it was quite a mixture of humility that God would deliver them, but his power over Egypt and their deliverance from Egypt would be a feeling of being set free, which we are to have too, about the idea of Christ, our Passover, sacrificed for us. Yeah, the Day of Atonement is the most solemn day of the year. There's really nothing. I mean, it did speak about forgiveness. Atonement means covering. Of course, the blood sprinkled on the mercy seat is the idea of atonement. It covered what was inside the demand of God found in the laws. But it was a very solemn day. The details of that chapter 16, of all that the high priest, it was a not a busy day for the nation, but it was a really busy day for him. All that he had to go through in a single day was quite a bit, changing clothes and different animals and different time, in and out a few times for him and his family, and then for the nation, and just very, very solemn, very serious on that day. So yeah, day of affliction. We call it Yom Kippur today, the Day of Atonement. And if you know any Jewish people, they fast all day, and then they don't eat until after sundown, because the fasting all day is kind of taken the place, or the idea of afflicting your souls, that you are to suffer to some degree. But then the meal then shows that the affliction is what has brought you into close relation with God. So then you eat the meal just to kind of show that. But yeah, Day of Atonement. Of course, that seventh month begins with Feast of Trumpets. It's called Yom Teruah, which really means day of noise. And the noise would often be the trumpet sound, but there'd be other noise. That's the first day of the seventh month. And all of these 7 feast days are ag related, crop related. So the spring feast, and it's most of the world cannot relate to it like we do here in the Central Valley of California, because our climate, our cycles of crops, our times of sowing and harvesting, all of those things about growing crops and different foods are very similar here in the Central Valley that Steve and I grew up in. So we're very well aware of the idea of the spring feast also picture the early harvest of the winter, early spring crops. And we have harvest in the late winter, early spring here. We have a big asparagus festival in Stockton, a town close to us. There's all kinds of food cattle food feed crops, and other kind of crops that are harvested in the early spring, but not near the amount as in the fall, but still some. And then, of course, Pentecost is the late spring, early summer. It'd be like our May and June. And here in the Central Valley, May and June, that's kind of like the beginning of the major harvest season. That's when we get our cherries and our strawberries and our apricots and those kind of early crops that really signal a summer-long building of the harvest that leads to the late summer, early fall, when all of our nut crops or tomatoes are at their prime, corn, all sorts of other crops, peaches and stone fruit, and all those are late summer, early fall. Grapes are a real big deal here in Central Valley. And so we follow the same patterns that Israel did. And those 7 feast days are very much ag-based because they're let me say their covenants that God gave to their fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, are very much based on them owning or inheriting and very much like Adam and Eve in the garden, in the language of the Levites in the tabernacle and temple, tending and keeping the garden. Israel was to make the land productive because it was their promised land. And so these feast days had a very close connection to the land because the land has a very close connection to the covenant promises. And so there are just a number of levels of application to these feast days, both spiritual and physical, literal kind of things involved in them.
Mm-hmm. I think it might serve me well, maybe the listeners well, to at least consider thinking about some of the extensions of these feast days and what they typified and what they really did represent and was completed by Christ. But I think as I was thinking about this the other day, we were reading through these feasts. I was thinking about, Easter week, or the week of prior to what we call Easter. It's not been uncommon for Liberty on the Sunday before Resurrection Sunday. We start talking about the 14th day of the first month of you are to take a lamb. So it's encouraged, at least at Liberty, for us to consider this week to be more than what the world calls Good Friday and what the world calls Easter. But it's you've encouraged, many of us encouraged as teachers, to think about and reflect on taking that lamb on the 14th or 10th day and observing it to the 14th day, I should have said. And then even considering the 15th day and what that means. And so we're encouraged to do that. But when I was reading all these feasts the other day, I don't probably do that on any of the other feasts. And I know it's meant quite a bit to Karen and I over the years on that week of Resurrection Week to consider and to think about it. And most, I think, that are listening would listen to this podcast would have the Passover on Thursday and maybe even some on Wednesday, and not necessarily on Friday like many say. But nevertheless, it's a time of reflection and a time of appreciation and a time of almost afflicting our souls in a way. But anyway, just a thought that I wanted to kind of leave, my last thought. here is to there'll be nothing wrong for any of us to consider expanding that more than just the week of Resurrection Week, but expanding that to some of the other feast days and consider what it means and share those thoughts with your family. And they'd be more meaningful when your children or grandchildren are reading through the book of Leviticus and you've already taught them some of these things and what it could mean to our souls. It's just a closing thought for me.
Good. Very good. I'll just maybe have a closing thought here. We could spend a whole session on this. This is, the part that limits us in these sessions that we do, because we're just barely going to touch on not just the idea of weekly Sabbath, which last session I talked some about the witness to the other nations of having a weekly Sabbath, that Israel would have more food, better health, better happiness, more knowledge by taking one day off a week than the other nations who were working all 7 days. And it would cause the nations to be curious about why, and they would start asking and finding out about Israel's God. That's even more emphasized, I would say, with the Sabbath year. Every 7 years, they were to let the land rest for a whole year. That's pretty amazing. Can you imagine the witness to the other nations? They're not working their fields. They're not harvesting. They're not pruning. They're not doing anything for a whole year. And the nations would probably think, they're probably going to starve to death next year. We're probably going to be able to go in and fight against them and defeat them and take over their land, because they're not going to have any food next year. And then the next year comes. And so the powerful witness of the Sabbath, weekly Sabbath, the 7th year Sabbath, and then even emphasize more in the Jubilee every 50th year. And what they were to do then, you mean let your slaves go free? How are you going to survive? Where do you get the labor, to work your fields and to harvest and everything? That's crazy. And every time all those weekly Sabbath, 7th year Sabbath, Jubilee, over the course of several generations, and Israel is still better off, has more, is healthier, all those things, smarter, because they're taking all this time off from producing food, yet what do they have more than us? So all these are not just designed, like the Sabbath year. I mean, who knew back then the value of letting your land rest and replenish itself? But that's a common practice today, rotating crops and everything. God was so far ahead of his time, as if he knew better than humans. But what a witness to the nations. And also for Israel to follow those practices of Sabbath was a matter of faith. It was very much an enlargement of when they went through the wilderness and had to collect twice as much of manna, and not on the Sabbath day. It was a matter of faith. We believe that God will provide for us. Well, all of these in the land throughout their history was also designed to be a matter of faith. God's telling us to let the land rest every 7 years. How are we going to survive? Well, trust the Lord. God says, I'll take care of it. Don't worry. So a witness to the nations and a matter of acting in faith to the Israelites is all built into these different Sabbaths that they were to observe. So I think that's a real important thing to bring up. And of course, we know that they violated those Sabbath years. We'll get into that when we get into the Kings and Chronicles and Samuel, of the beginning of them not following these, and the reason they went into Babylon for 70 years. But that's for another time. It's too much to develop right now. But all of those are important. And I would just say one more thing in closing, because I think this is really important, that great chapter 26 of the blessings and the curses. And maybe I guess it's the preacher in me. I like to close with kind of building toward an invitation. But in 26, he starts talking about the blessings, but then in verse 14, but if you do not obey me, and as this chapter, like it does in Deuteronomy, the list of curses is longer than the list of blessings. So kind of trying to get their attention. But he says in verse 19, I will break the pride of your power. Isn't that the heart of the gospel message? Is God wants to break the pride of our power, humble us so that we surrender to him. And that's what he wants to do all through our life, is to break the pride of your power. That's maybe the most important thing that can happen in our life, either for salvation or service, is for God to break the pride of our power. Humility is what he is looking for, directed by faith. And then finally, on a larger scale regarding the nation of Israel, he says in verse 40, but if they confess their iniquity, and he says in verse 41, if their uncircumcised hearts are humbled and they accept their guilt. And that feeds into a lot about what prophecy is about, is that at the return of Christ, they will humble themselves and they will accept their guilt and they will be forgiven. And that famous passage of Psalm 118, verse 26, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And they said that at the triumphal entry, speaking about that final week of Christ. But they did not do it in faith or repentance. And so he rejected that. But he said, you'll not see me again until you say it again. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. That's Matthew 23:39, one of the famous untils. And when they say that again, that'll be in their repentance. They will be forgiven. And that's Zechariah, of course, chapter 12, verse 10. They will look on him whom they pierced, and they will weep and repent. So this idea of within these blessings and curses is that even if you are living in a time of what we call covenant discipline, which is where they are now, when they repent, they will be forgiven, they will be received back. And that is a big part of what will happen at the return of Christ. So I didn't think that today's session would go as long as it did, because we confined ourselves strictly to Leviticus. We didn't even get into the first 6 chapters of Numbers according to our daily Bible readings, but we'll pick up in Numbers next session. There's a lot to be said there, so I'm glad we didn't feel rushed to go into Numbers today, because it was just too much to talk about in Leviticus. Any closing?
A lot of good stuff. Well, a lot of good things you said today, and provoked me to some more thoughts. And but I'm going to hold some of those thoughts for next week, because I think they tie in closer to their first disassembling of the tabernacle and moving out. And that'll be in chapter 10 next week.
So that's called, in TV and radio language, that's called a tease. You build up people's interest to tune in next session. So we hope that you do, and hope that this session proved to be a blessing to you and a challenge to you to go study some more on your own. So God bless everyone.